Hello, class, and welcome to week 5 of our asynchronous semester. What I want to do today is just kind of go over the readings that you did last week a little bit, and then I'll kind of explain some of the assignments, but again, I'll post them on the announcements as well. So, first thing, basically my intention of assigning these first two readings is to introduce you to the concept of academic writing, whereas previously we had been focusing on good writing in general, with love letters and things of that nature, and certainly a lot of that carries over to what makes for good academic writing. But I wanted to introduce the idea that also the academic writing is its own unique genre and has kind of expectations built around that genre. So the first thing that many of you have probably noted from that first article, Contemporary Composition, is that is basically the difficulty of it. So I know some of you probably had to read that multiple times to make any kind of sense of it. And I did that intentionally. I did that to make a point. And the point is as follows, is that academia is a club, and probably you're not in it. So if you struggled with that, it's not because you're not smart or anything like that. It's because this is a discourse that for most freshmen, you're not familiar with it. It's a different way of speaking, et cetera, and so on. I could just as easily have given you an article about skateboarding, and if you have no familiarity with skateboarding, it would be equally difficult. And so that's the idea here: is that this is sort of a discourse, a way of speaking to one another, etc., that you all have to assimilate to some degree in order to advance in your academic careers. And then I've got some other points I want to make as well. So, but briefly, I want to start with the first article, Contemporary Composition. And in addition to just making that point that it's a difficult read and this is a way of communicating that most of you aren't familiar with, I did want to kind of go over a few of the points, because there's the content also deals with what we mean by academic culture, and in this case specifically referencing rhetoric or the study of writing. So in this class, this is really a rhetoric class, and rhetoric, in its simplest definition, is the art of persuasion, right? Is communicating in some way in order to persuade others. That doesn't have to be written communication. It can be verbal. It can also be a pitcher that's trying to persuade. All kinds of methods for doing so, and the primary persuasive methods are ethos, pathos, and logos. And we're going to deal with all three of those things this semester. Briefly speaking, pathos refers to the attempt to persuade people by appealing to their emotions. Ethos is the attempt to persuade people by appealing to authority or expertise. And logos is the attempt to persuade people via logical, rational thought. So our emphasis will be on all of our essays will focus on all three of those, but the emphasis will be on the first two for our first two essays, and on logos, the last one, for our final two essays, or essay and final exam rather. And so that's important to note, because those words you'll hear again this semester. And so what I normally do in class with that first article is I break it down. So the first thing to note, so that I want you to know, is that what academic writing is just that. It's being able to participate in the discourse. So there's already a conversation going on, and your job as an academic writer is to contribute to that conversation, right? So if I jumped into a conversation with skateboarders and said, "Hey, yesterday I did this super cool trick where I spun my board and landed on it," I would immediately out myself as not part of that group, right? So the same thing goes for academia. How can we participate in that conversation? And that is not only knowing the style of communication, but also the content, right? And so what this article does is it begins by stating what that conversation is. And the conversation is about how to teach writing. Um, and his suggestion is that the current consensus on that topic is that all of the different writing pedagogies, so look up that word if you didn't earlier, both the classical, the positivist, the expressionists or Neoplatonists, and the new rhetoric, all four of those deal with the same components of the rhetorical process, right? Writer, reader, reality, and language. Um, and that the only difference between those different methods is on what they emphasize amongst those four things: writer, reader, reality, and language, right? So that's the consensus, that's the discussion. Where he comes in, and what we try to do in academic writing is we need a point to make. We need something to add to the conversation. If he were just going to repeat what others have already said, there would be no reason for him to write an article. But he happens to disagree with that consensus and suggests that it's not just a matter of emphasis, but that each of those rhetorical pedagogies um, define writer, reader, reality, and language differently. Okay, so what I've done in the past is we've written on the board classical, positivist, expressionist, and new rhetoric on one column, and then at the top we have writer, reader, reality, and language, and we make a little chart. So it might help you to do that, to understand this a little better. But I'm going to kind of go through that with you a little bit, and we're going to start with the classical, right? So one of the classical, and I think we're going to start with is how it defines reality or knowledge in other words. And for the in the classical rhetorical tradition, reality is defined. If we had to put some adjectives to it, it would be absolute. It would be rational. In large part because knowledge or reality is discerned and comes to us via what's called deduction, right? And deduction, and so deductive logic, you'll hear that word again later in the semester when we do our argumentative essays. But deduction is a process, is a reasoning process by which new knowledge is created from old knowledge. And so the technical definition of a deductive argument is that it's an argument in which your claim is restates the premises or contains your premises is the exact wording. But that I find that that's kind of confusing to students. So the way I prefer to explain it is that a deductive argument is an argument in which your audience has to agree with your conclusion if they accept your evidence, right? And then inductive arguments are arguments in which the evidence merely suggests the conclusion. So it's possible to agree with the evidence and still disagree with the conclusion, right? So the classic example of deduction from Aristotle is all dogs are animals. So and so has a pet dog. Ergo, conclusion, so and so has a pet mammal, right? If I agree with premise one and premise two, I have to agree with that conclusion, right? And so that is where knowledge comes from in this classical tradition. And that means that if knowledge is absolute, etc., it means the writer or the person who's conveying knowledge or disseminating reality is also rational, right, and deductive. And it means truth in this sense is absolute. So it's not relative or subjective. It's an absolute truth. What's true for in the classical tradition for you is true for everybody. Okay, and so that means that that writer is conveying absolute truths and giving it to the reader. So the reader then is defined as a recipient of knowledge in sort of a passive sense, right? And then that means what's interesting about the classical tradition is that language is also equivalent to knowledge. In other words, the same way that I discover truth or reality through deduction is the method I use in writing, right? So it's a deductive argument that I make to persuade people of the truth. And in the classical tradition, that could be muddied up a little bit for Aristotle. Logos was how you communicated in his mind with other aristocrats, let's face it. and that the plebes, the lesser humans, you had to use other strategies such as pathos and ethos. But the primary method of, and the only real effective and true method of conveying reality and truth for in the classical tradition was through deduction. Okay, so now if we jump down to the positivists, right, here knowledge is still rational, but knowledge or reality is still rational, but it's probabilistic, right? And so here, truth, rather than being deductive, is primarily inductive, right? So this is when our premises suggest a conclusion, right? It's what we see in the courtroom, right? We found the defendant's fingerprints at the scene of the crime. We have two witnesses who saw him fleeing the scene immediately after the crime. Conclusion, the prosecutor's conclusion, he must be guilty. Defense might say, oh, I agree with your evidence. Those are my defendants, my client's fingerprints, and those witnesses did see the right person. But that's because he stumbled upon this and tried to save the victim and then chased away the victim, and was seen by these other people while doing so, right? So I've agreed, the defense attorney has agreed with your evidence, but disagreed with the conclusion, right? And so you can only do that with induction. So with under the positivist sense, then knowledge is probabilistic and inductive, right? This is important because this changes the role of the writer. If what we're talking about basically here with the positivist tradition is the scientific method, right? I look at something, gather data, I make an observation, I gather data, I form a hypothesis, I test my hypothesis, and then I draw conclusions. Today we would add, I publish my conclusions so others can reproduce my test, and so forth and so on. But it's that method. But what that means is that truth and reality, unlike in the classical tradition, is discovered through the scientific method, not through the writing process. So language has changed. There's a step of removal from reality and truth in the positivist tradition that doesn't exist in the classical tradition, where they're the same method for expression is the method I use for discovery, right? So under the positivist tradition, knowledge is discovered, but it's discovered outside of the writing process. So language here is a little different. So language becomes more about audience, finding the right audience. It's informative and persuasive. And because truth exists outside of that rhetorical process. So I have to convince you by another method that really is true. So a lot of pathos and ethos can come in here that don't come, in addition to induction, that don't come into play in the classical tradition. Okay, so now we move on to the expressionist or Neoplatonist ideas. And again, the same things, but we radically change. We start again with reality or knowledge. It's radically changed here. This comes from Plato. Plato's whole idea of truth was about unlearning, right? His idea is all of us possess what he called an inner daemon that knows reality, but we pollute it with all this junk that we fill our heads with. And that to get back in touch with that daemon, we have to unlearn. And we can do this through the process of induction. If you've ever read any of the Socratic dialogues, you can see how that works. Somebody comes and says something to Socrates like, hey, I'm a virtuous man. And Socrates kind of plays dumb and says, oh, well, that's great, because I've always wanted to know what it means to be a virtuous man. But now I have someone who can tell me, so what does it mean to be virtuous? And he says, well, it means to do the will of the gods. And he says, oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Oh, but one question. What if, under the Greeks, remember, they're polytheistic, the different gods have different ideas about virtue. So which god? And anyway, that's the rabbit hole they go down until at the end, the person who claimed his virtue doesn't know what he thinks anymore. So it's unlearning that is focused on here, so we can get in touch with our subjective truth. So here, truth is not absolute, it's not probabilistic, it's subjective and relative to the individual, right? So if our idea of truth and reality changes, then of course, so does the role of the writer, right? And here, things like voice, right? And analogy is very important. I can't know your personal truth. All I can do is kind of equate it with my truth, and we can find parallels and similarities. So um, metaphors and things like this become really important in terms of language under the Socratic tradition, as does what's called the dialectic. So here, language, this is seen as a conversation between two people with different ideas of truth who are using analogy to kind of come together. So language becomes more conversational under the Platonic tradition here. And of course, so the reader has a more active role, let's say, than they do in the previous two, where they were the passive recipients of truth. Okay, so that leads us to the final one, the new rhetoric. And the author has two goals in this essay. The first goal is to say that the conversation consensus is wrong, and that it's not just about emphasis, but about definitions and meaning in these different rhetorical methods. He has a secondary purpose, which is to advocate for one of these strategies over the other three, and that's the new rhetoric. This is the one the author prefers, and the one I prefer, and that we'll adopt in this class, and we'll get to his reasoning for that later. But the new rhetoric is a little different. The new rhetoric, truth is not so much discovered as it is in the previous three, as created, right? Now in a sense, we're back to the classical tradition in that our method for discovering truth is the same as our method for expressing the truth. So language and truth and reality are equivalent, but for different reasons. Here, because language is or truth is a construct of language, right? Whether that be the language of mathematics, 2 plus 2 equals 4, or the language of Japanese or English, right? It's only through language that human beings can have access to reality, right? So, in other words, in this school of thought, there might be a cell phone here, right? But until I convert that sensual observation into language, cell phone, which belongs to me, etc., and give it meaning, that I can only do that through language. Okay, so now the role, if truth has changed as something that's created via language, then the role of the writer has changed to a creator, right? But what's interesting with the new rhetoric is that the role of the reader changes as well. The reader here is a co-creator. So language is again dialectic, but for different reasons, because the writer and the reader are collectively creating reality, right? So I can tell you something, but you might interpret those words differently than the way I meant them when I said it, right? And the truth, or when I write something, we might read something that's different from what the author had in mind, right? And that's the truth, right? Is that what's created through that process, through that dialectical process, right? So writer and reader are one and the same here, and they're both mutually informing the other. And so we have, again, a conversationalist sort of writing strategy, in which we're aware of our audience just as we were in the positivist, but for a different reason, because our audience is helping us to create knowledge in this sense. Okay. And so he advocates for that for two reasons. Reason number one is because it's the most comprehensive, right? If I am teaching new rhetoric, then you're going to learn all of the other language elements. You're going to learn about metaphor. You're going to learn the dialectical styles. You're going to learn about audience and purpose and all those things, right? All the things that are emphasized in those others. But if I'm just teaching, say, the classical tradition, then you're going to miss out on how pathos methods are used to convey information. You're going to miss out a lot on metaphor and simile and so forth. And so if you have a teacher who's only teaching you that method, then if you get another class that's focusing on something else, you're going to kind of be in the dark a little bit. So that's his first reason for supporting the new rhetoric. The second is because, as he argues, this is more consistent with today's concept of what we call epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, what we know and how we know it, or why we think we know it, right? And for him, this is where we are today, that knowledge is, in fact, created by our observations, by our participation in it. And we can't extract ourselves as some objective scientist that's not participating in the world he, she is observing, right? And so that's the second reason, is that by teaching the new rhetoric, we're teaching the latest and most correct form of, of reality as we see it. Okay. Now, there's another reason I favor it, and that leads us to the next article: "Kill the Indian, Save the Man." Right. That one hopefully was a much easier read, but also maybe a lot more infuriating for some of you. So it's interesting here. The discussion is different. The discussion in this case is, you got people on this side, which are maybe saying the only good Indian is a dead Indian, right? And people over here who are maybe saying that's a culture that is equal to ours and we should leave them alone. He comes in the middle and says, no, it's not that the Native Americans are inferior by birth, right? They're just inferior by culture. And so he means it quite literally: kill the Indian, save the man, is that we can, if we can just get rid of that backwards, primitive, savage culture of the Native Americans, they can be equal to white Christian Europeans, right? And so that's his argument: is if we can kill the Indian, kill the culture in them, we'll make them human, and they'll be better for it, right? And how do we do that? Education, right? So when I have in-person classes, I always throw this out. Well, have things changed, right? When you go to college, do you have teachers who are going to try to kill the Latinx in you in order to save the man, kill the black in order to save the man, kill the femaleness in you to save your, et cetera, and so on? And my response is, of course, that's what's happening. Now, there is a twist to it, right? There is a twist to it, but of course that's happening. Of course, you are being brainwashed when you come to college. You're being assimilated into a culture, as we just talked about, right? But, right, a few things. One, there are different ways to handle that. You don't have, there's a lot of wiggle room in between sellout and dropout, right? You can perform to competency while preserving your own heritage and institutions. And there's more to discuss there that would come into play in another class, but I'll just leave it at that for now. But I wanted to take it back to the idea of the new rhetoric, right? If we take the new rhetoric concept of writing seriously, then it isn't the old school concept of education where your teachers are full of wisdom and knowledge and you're like little birds with your mouths open waiting to be fed the wisdom that I have to give you, right? And I come and sprinkle a little wisdom in each of your mouths and send you away as happy, well-fed birds or something, right? If I'm doing my job as with new rhetoric, then that's differently. That means I am creating knowledge with you. Together we're doing that, right? And so for that reason, I want to make sure that cultural assimilation becomes a part of this. Even if your goal is to burn the entire structure down, you can't do that unless you can talk the talk and participate within the culture. And it's not a culture of, this is a culture of power, maybe not to the degree it was 500 years ago, but it's still a culture of power. And being able to participate in that culture of power means that you're empowered to make changes. If you're not able to participate in that culture of power, you can't do so. So it is important to be able to do that. And so it doesn't apply in an online class, but what I do in my in-person classes is I offer extra credit opportunities to attend outside academic and literary events, and then you can write summaries of that and responses similar to what you did with these two essays, and you can do that to make up for missed classes and things of that nature. So we can't do that with an asynchronous class, but I can encourage you to attend or even to watch YouTube lectures of things of this nature too. So as hard as that is, that those concepts were, the struggle you put into reading this will make it much easier the next time you're exposed to those words and so on, right? So just and not just passively listening in, but if you can actively participate. That's why in person I don't allow YouTube lectures for this, but if you can, comment and leave questions. There are a lot of Zoom lectures going on, and I will periodically post ideas about things that are happening throughout the semester, maybe Zoom lectures and things like that, that will give you the opportunity to explore this culture a little bit more further and be able to participate in it better, right? But primarily, this is what I wanted to do with these two essays, is to introduce the idea of academic writing and what that is. Okay, so what I'd like you to do for this week is first step number one. I'd just like you to make a comment or question underneath this video, and so we'll kind of keep this conversation going a little bit. If there's something that was confusing for you, maybe ask about that, or just make a comment if you can apply this to your own life. Hey, I've experienced this. Or maybe you've read another book. There's Richard Rodriguez has written a really good book about this very concept. I think it's called The Fire of Desire. I might be wrong on that, but he writes about his assimilation into academic culture as a gay Latino, and how he had to even start to look down on his own culture in order to succeed, and how he coped and dealt with that. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff out there. So reply however you like. And then after that, we're going to start now talking about that first graded essay, which is the narrative essay. So read over those instructions that are in your syllabus. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about the first element. So basically what this assignment is you're going to write a story, but it's sort of a hybrid assignment. Instead of just getting all creative and making a fun, entertaining story, it's going to be a story that demonstrates rhetoric, the art of persuasion. So in this sense, what you're going to be doing is you're going to tell a story that argues for something that will work as an academic thesis statement. Either you can include your thesis statement in the story and underline it, or you can write it down separately from the essay at the end of your story. So either of those options are okay. If I don't see a thesis statement, you'll just get a 0 and have to start over and do it again. So make sure to do that. And so I want to begin this week and working on that first element, and the most important. In fact, what I tell students in class is that this is probably the most important thing you'll learn all semester. If you learn it well, you'll have gotten your money's worth, which is how to write a good thesis statement, what it means, what a thesis statement is, and how to do that. So we're going to experiment with that this week, and I'm going to have each of you generate 5 thesis statements of your own, following some criteria that I'll give you in the assignment instructions. And then we'll post those as discussions. And I'm going to have you attempt in your responses, to those comments, I'm going to have you rewrite those thesis statements to try to make them better. And hopefully by the end of that, we'll have each of you will have at least one really good thesis statement. And if that may or not be one you use for this first assignment, but it will go a long way if you can develop the skill to write a good thesis statement, not just for this class, but throughout the rest of your academic career. So those will be the 2 things we're working on this week. And then next week, we'll talk briefly about what we mean by narrative, what we mean by a story, what that is. And then we'll do a brainstorming a couple brainstorming activities that will give you possibilities. And we do these as in-class assignments that can generate possible rough drafts for students, and we'll do these online instead. And so by the end of that, you'll have hopefully at least 2, maybe 3 094 students will have more possibilities of things you can submit as your rough draft, or you can do something completely differently, right? But if you're keeping up with your assignments, then there's no reason to be late on that first upcoming deadline, which is when your narrative rough draft will be due, because you'll have already done them from the other assignments. And you can always turn one of those in and change your mind later, okay? So as always, if you have any questions about anything, shoot me an email, and if we need to talk by phone, we can always do that. You might too. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who also teaches at CCD, and he said he's having Zoom office hours. So if you think that's a good idea, let me know. Just I can schedule a time during the week where I'll be available on Zoom and we can see each other's faces or whatever. So yeah, let me know if you think that's a good idea. So yeah, email me if you have questions, thoughts, or concerns, and I will post. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So hope everybody's doing well, and until the next video or phone chat or whatever. Bye bye.